Welcome to this week's episode of United Boxing, where we cover boxing from the United Kingdom and the United States. I'm boxing writer David Greisman, and I'm joined as always by British boxing broadcaster and analyst Darren Rees. Darren, boxing has a habit of making an ass of itself, but on Friday, more than 60 million households around the world got an unexpected look at Mike Tyson's bare behind. Is your life complete now? Can you retire from this sport now, knowing that nothing will ever surpass that experience?
They did him dirty there, didn't they? They really did him dirty. But this sport never ever fails to surprise me in any way, shape, or form. It's that there is nothing which can happen in the sport of boxing which will make me think, "Wow, I didn't expect that to happen."
Well, I think what happened between Tyson and Paul last week was what we expected, but we'll get to that a little bit later. We may be joking now about Mike Tyson's butt, but he's not going to be the butt of our jokes in this episode. We would still be remiss if we didn't talk about everything that happened in that huge event last week between Tyson and Paul, as well as that fantastic rematch on the undercard between Katie Taylor and Amanda Serrano. And we, of course, need to talk about the big show in Riyadh in which Gilberto Ramirez defeated our guest from last week's episode, Chris Billam-Smith. We'll also be joined by our special guest this week, boxing writer Kieran Mulvaney, who was there live for Tyson versus Paul. And as you'll hear, Kieran is from the UK, but based in the US. So, Darren, let's talk about that event. I know you didn't necessarily watch live, but how was your experience?
So, as a spectacle, it looked pretty fantastic. 70,000 people in that stadium. It did look pretty special. And like you said, I didn't watch it live, but watching it back, it just looked very crisp. Everything was run very nicely, and I think that could be quite a thing with Netflix moving into live sports like boxing. That's obviously a bit of a tester for them, and would have got them quite a few new subscribers and whatever else. I have got to say though, I felt that the commentary, and we'll get onto a bit of that, was appalling at times. Really, really terrible. And just seemed a bit WWE to me. But everything else around it, the whole presentation piece, looked fantastic. But we're not here to summarise how good and how crisp the HD looked on the screen. I'll be completely truthful with you. I only watched one fight, and that was the Amanda Serrano-Katie Taylor fight. Did you watch it all?
I watched the entire main broadcast. I didn't watch the YouTube prelims, but I did see online that there were hundreds of thousands of people who were watching those preliminary fights around the world, which is pretty good. And that is a good sign for the marketability that Jake Paul and Mike Tyson brought to the table, which is then good for the fight that you're talking about between Amanda Serrano and Katie Taylor. So let's actually start with the good stuff first before we get to the letdown. And let's talk about that fight between Katie Taylor and Amanda Serrano. Did it live up to the expectations after their fight of the year in 2022?
I think it did. We had yet another classic, really, didn't we? Especially when you got to the later rounds. I didn't have a problem with the scoring. And I think if you're going to shout robbery, that not you, but people in general, especially the commentary team on that day, on that evening, literally screaming robbery, not only about that fight, but they were screaming robbery about the fight which happened at Madison Square Gardens as well. I think if you're going to do that in a close fight, you need to have really watched the fight closely like a judge would. You need to be looking at each and every round. Who's the more effective fighter in this round? Who's the more efficient fighter? Who's catching the cleaner, more eye-catching shots? You need to be looking at each round as its own fight, 10 separate fights in that sort of way, and then you need to be properly and professionally scoring it. And I scored it like that, not for enjoyment, like I was a judge, and I scored it 95-94 to Katie Taylor. The first 3 rounds for me were quite comfortable Katie Taylor rounds. But then I would say that towards the middle of the fight and then going towards the end of it, the fight started to become a lot closer and a lot more competitive. And I found that the rounds which I personally gave Amanda Serrano were a lot closer rounds than the rounds I gave Katie Taylor. There were a couple of rounds within there which were very kind of sort of 50-50 at times for quite big moments of those rounds, but the rounds which Amanda Serrano scored for me, where I said, right, that's a 10-9 round to Serrano, were the rounds which were the closest. What did you make of it?
I didn't score live, and part of that was because, as you probably heard, Netflix had a lot of issues with the stream that night. So it just wasn't possible for me to be able to watch in real time without buffering going on there. That said, I'm glad. I think now that we are 2.5, 3 days later, that these scorecards aren't the main story. I think more people are just talking about what a great fight that was. And that is what I was hoping for, is that these two women, who are two of the best fighters of all time in women's boxing, are having their legacies elevated by fighting in front of, according to Netflix, 50 million people worldwide 50 million households were watching them, which means that if you've got 2 or 3 or more people on your couch or in front of your computer screen, those numbers are even bigger. So these two women were already the highest paid women boxers ever. Hopefully, for whatever time they have left in the sport, their stature will be elevated even further, because I know that Katie Taylor is 38 years old and Amanda Serrano is 36. I'm just so impressed with the high level, the heart, the guts, the skill at which they both perform in the ring. And I have to give additional credit then to Amanda Serrano. I know that she's moved up and down on the scales over the years, but truly she is a featherweight. And she'd gone up 2 weight divisions to face Katie Taylor when they fought in 2022. Here she was at 140, more than holding her own. I don't know what is next for them. And I think you and I can get into that shortly. But I would also be happy if all they ever did for the rest of their careers was fight each other.
I was thinking earlier on when I rewatched the fight again that I could genuinely just watch Katie Taylor and Amanda Serrano fight every week for a whole year, because I think you could put them in a ring with each other 52 times, and 52 times it'd be exciting bouts. They are just great dancing partners, aren't they, for each other?
They truly are. I think about the fact, I don't know how you are with your friends who aren't into boxing, but I always will show them like Gaddy Ward or Kraus Castillo. And so now, if you ever want to get somebody to buy into the idea of women's boxing, you show them both fights between Katie Taylor and Amanda Serrano.
You do. You do. It had a bit of everything, just like the first fight did. And like I said to you in last week's show, I felt that in that very, very close fight at Madison Square Garden, that Amanda Serrano just edged it. And this time round, I felt that Katie Taylor edged it. And when I say it had a bit of everything, there was literally a bit of everything. There was some really good skill. There was flurries of punches, punches and bunches. There was some really good technical boxing as well. Katie Taylor was doing some fantastic counter punching, especially as Amanda Serrano came forward, and she would just kind of step off with her lead hook and then follow it up with a right hand over the top, which worked really nicely for her. And then Amanda Serrano was extremely aggressive and just had one motion, which was forward. It was a bit frustrating to hear the commentary team saying that over and over again, that Katie Taylor was deliberately headbutting Amanda Serrano. I don't think that was a case. To be truthful, I don't think that was the case. I think it was a mix-up of styles, southpaw versus orthodox. And when you watch the replays in slow motion, you can see that it's just both of them coming in together as they're throwing their shots, and boom, heads come together. Guess what? It's boxing. It happens. It was a nasty cut, though, wasn't it? I got to say, I think if that cut happened under the eyes of the British Boxing Board of Control, I don't think they would have allowed that fight to continue for the length they did.
I completely agree with you. Although in hindsight, I'm glad that they did let it go so that we could see the fight that we did. But that cut will take time to heal and could potentially affect Amanda Serrano in the future if it doesn't ever heal completely. I think about Israel Vasquez and the eye damage that he had toward the end of his career after his fights with Rafa Marquez, which leads to my question, what next for Katie Taylor and Amanda Serrano? And I think the answer for Serrano is that she's going to have to recover. So what next for Katie Taylor?
Yeah, I've been thinking about this, and there might not be many people who agree with this answer, and probably just want more and more because of the exciting fights which Katie Taylor has been in. You just think about people who have completed boxing, and I would put Katie Taylor into that category. She won golds at pretty much every amateur championship on the European stage, which is one of the toughest places to win an amateur championship. She won gold at the World. She won gold at London 2012. She's a multiple-time world champion. She's headlined Madison Square Garden. She just fought in front of 70,000 people in an enormous stadium in Texas, in front of at least 60, 70, 80 million people on Netflix. She's been paid a decent amount of money. Again, I'll fight their corners and say they should be getting paid even more than what they have. But what a career! Like, if she decided to hang the gloves up now, I don't think she'd regret it. What about you? What's your gut feeling when it comes to Katie Taylor?
We'll talk about this a little bit more with Kieran later on, but I'm wondering if in lieu of a third fight immediately with Amanda Serrano, we get a third fight with Chantel Cameron. They did go back and forth with Cameron winning the first fight, close fight, and then Katie Taylor winning the second time around. I feel like there's unfinished business. I don't think that Katie Taylor should move up in weight. The fact that she was getting hurt by Amanda Serrano, and Amanda Serrano is, of course, as skilled as she is, I don't know that Katie Taylor would be able to succeed at 147 against the likes of a Michaela Mayer or a Sandy Ryan. And I also don't know that moving up in weight is this late in a career is good for a fighter. I just wonder, though, given the paydays that she's now earning, she's at the peak of her earning potential. Should she retire now, she'd be giving up that kind of those kinds of paydays.
And also, she's 38 years old. No, she's no spring chicken in terms of being a high performing athlete and being in grueling contests like that. I mean, how far do you take it? Like, she seems like she's in a good place in terms of her health. I bet she's in a good place in terms of her wealth. She's somebody she's somebody that can step outside of boxing, and she's not going to be. No way is she going to be like Conor McGregor, out partying and buying magnum bottles of champagne. She lives a very simple life. She likes to keep herself to herself, and I'm sure that she'll be comfortable for a very long time. So I wouldn't be bothered if I see her retire. To be truthful.
And maybe the last thing for her to do then would be a little bit of a retirement tour through the UK, through the Europe, to capitalize on her popularity, but to lower that risk reward ratio a little bit.
Yeah, I think so. And do you know what? I had the luxury and the privilege of watching Katie Taylor in my favourite boxing venue in the world, York Hall, which only holds like 1,200 people. And the people in Britain will be very familiar with it. There isn't a bad place to watch boxing in that place. And I watched Katie Taylor fight Jessica McCaskill, and the place was rocking. The Irish came over, they drank all the beer. Literally, York Hall had no beer left at all. And I got to watch her in her proper prime, fighting in a venue like that. So it would be great to see her maybe just doing a few of those. Go back to Dublin, have a fight in Dublin, maybe one more in London, and call it a day. But who knows?
It was the lead-in that we needed into the main event, even had the main event not been the letdown that it was. And we got very fortunate that there were two very good fights on the undercard. The fight preceding that was the welterweight title fight between Mario Barrios and Abel Ramos. And Barrios seemed like he was going to be winning handily early on. He scored a knockdown, I think, in the second round. But Ramos, as Adam Abramowitz told us on the show a couple weeks back, will lay your hands on you. And that's what happened. He hurt Barrios later on and ended up, they fought each other to a draw. I know that you didn't watch the fight, but it was a fantastic fight. Not as fantastic as Taylor versus Serrano, but definitely enjoyable. I do wonder what this means for Barrios going forward. The welterweight division is restocking right now that both Terrence Crawford and Errol Spence are gone. So the title holders are Barrios, Imantas Stanionis, Boots Ennis, who had his own struggles the other week in victory over Karen Chukashan, and Brian Norman Jr. To be determined, but that was a good show. Less good was, of course, the main event between Mike Tyson and Jake Paul. I feel like there were three opinions of people coming out of the show, and that depended on what they were thinking coming in. And I touched on this in my Fighting Words column that's now on BoxingScene, which I titled, Are You Not Entertained? The expectations that people had, some people were really expecting or hoping that they'd get the Mike Tyson of old and not just an old Mike Tyson. They were expecting a competitive fight, and I think those were the people who were let down. There were the people who just wanted to see Mike Tyson for old time's sake, even if they know that he wasn't going to be himself. And maybe that at least appreciated it, even though they knew the fight just wasn't that good. And then there were those like me who were just concerned about Tyson. I tell you, I think I spent most of those 8 rounds biting my fingernails, figuratively, not literally the way that Tyson was through his gloves during that fight, just hoping that he wasn't going to get hurt. I know that you didn't watch the fight, but what were you hearing from your friends, from other people in the UK before, during, after the fight?
I think I've told you this before that Mike Costello, the legendary British broadcaster who we've had on the podcast, splits fights into 3 categories. And there's a reason I'm telling you this. Mike says that there's fights that boxing fans watch, and then there's fights which sports fans watch, and then there's fights which everyone watches. Now, not everyone watched this, and I feel like we need like this fourth random weird category these days because this whole exhibition YouTube stuff has opened that up. I can't believe how many people I didn't expect to be interested in this, what were interested in this and watched the fight. Like, one of my auntie's friends stayed up through the night. At, bearing in mind it's UK time. This is like a 58-year-old lady who doesn't really care about sport, to tell you the truth. But she stayed up because she wanted to see Mike Tyson knock this gobby YouTuber out who she hated his attitude. This is the sort of category of people that this fight grabbed hold of. I couldn't be bothered with it because I knew exactly what it was going to be. And I just thought, I'll watch what I want to watch back the next day. But going back to what you said as well, I also can't believe how many people thought that Mike Tyson might beat 26, 27-year-old Jake Paul, however old he is. And I can't tell you how many messages I got. I joked with you the other day and said I've had over 50 people message me and ask me my opinion on the fight before it happens. There was probably about, 11, 12, 13 separate people. But I can't believe how many people still thought that a 58-year-old Mike Tyson would be the same as he was 30 years ago.
And he wasn't even that good 20 years ago when he lost to Kevin McBride. It's funny, you're talking about that 58-year-old woman. I think she had more endurance and stamina staying up late than Tyson had in the ring that night.
Yeah, I tell you what, you've hit the nail on the head there because look, I've read about the fight. I've read your boxing scene article. I've followed what some of my friends and colleagues have been saying on X and other places about it, and it sounds like he just went very, very flat-footed, very, very quickly, and showed about 3 seconds of the old Mike Tyson inverted commas, and the rest of it was a bit of a shit show.
There are people out there right now who are thinking that this was staged. They're conspiracy theorists who think, oh, well, Tyson looked so great in these videos that we saw on social media and the marketing materials. Well, yeah, no shit. That was meant to market the fight. There's a difference between when you are training and you have a trainer or whoever holding pads in front of you, and when you have somebody like Jake Paul. And yes, Jake Paul is never going to be confused with the top cruiserweight or top heavyweight, but he's good enough in this training that he's truly done over the past 5 years and young enough and athletic enough that he knows how to avoid, to keep good distance. And Tyson also had to pace himself. He couldn't fight 6 rounds with Kevin McBride when he was 38, 39 years old. What was he going to do at 58 years old? I can't do the things that I did as a hiker 3 years ago, and I'm 42 now.
I know it's crazy, but I do feel like we need to open up this new category because in a bit we're going to come on to yet another bonkers fight and the whole Misfits thing with Tommy Fury. But it comes back again to what we said at the start, or what I said at the start. This sport of boxing will never ever surprise me.
It's going to be interesting seeing what happens going forward from 3 angles, whether Netflix remains involved in boxing or at least in these boxing sideshows. Be interesting to see whether Tyson, who of course said that he was open to fighting again, after getting tens of millions of dollars, will actually fight on. I don't think he will. And what will happen with Jake Paul from here on out?
Yeah, I think with Jake Paul, that there's lots of people. And look, I said last week, he can punch, and he can punch because he's not people out. He's properly not people over. He knows how to throw a punch, and he's obviously got some weight behind it. He's not terrible, but he's far from a good boxer. Look, he boxed Tommy Fury and got beaten. Tommy Fury isn't a great boxer. Tommy Fury would struggle, in my opinion, to win a Southern Area title, to win an English title, to win. He's no way near British title level. No way near. Could he beat Craig Richards? Could he hell? Could he beat Joshua Buatsi or Anthony Yard? Could he hell? And Tommy Fury beat Jake Paul. That shows you the levels which Jake Paul is fighting at.
And that was just a year and a half ago. So while Jake Paul might have improved, he can't have improved that much.
No, and to the point I was getting to before I went on a tangent and started ranting is Jake Paul needs to, like, if he wants to be regarded as a boxer by actual boxing people, then he's gonna have to beat someone at least decent. I can't even think of a name which he would beat in, like, the, I don't know, light heavy or cruiserweight division. Really, he's probably a super middleweight if he did things properly. But I can't think of a single name that he could actually beat, which other people listening to this would have heard of. And in terms of Tyson, he just needs to get a cigar, get his slippers, put his feet up, and enjoy an open fire.
With Jake Paul, it's interesting that we want him to face true opponents out there. But when you are getting this kind of audience and this kind of payday to face a 58-year-old retired fighter, when you're getting the paydays that he's had to face the likes of some of these former mixed martial artists, it's no wonder that the first words out of Jake Paul's mouth were Canelo Alvarez, or people are wondering whether it might be Conor McGregor or some of these other guys. I don't know what we'll see from Jake Paul going forward. I do think that the risk-reward ratio will change because you can only fool people or sucker people so many times.
You can, and I've just given Jake Paul a hard time, and I stand by every single word that I said. But one thing I will say about him is, yes, I don't like him. I don't like the way he does business. I don't like the way he goes about his work. He is my nightmare person to be stuck in a lift with. Like, I'm trying to think of someone worse. What I will say is genius marketeer. Is that a word, marketeer? Can I use that?
Yeah, you can use that. You know, we
Yeah.
were talking the other week about whether Jake Paul was Marmite, and I compared him to the rotten shark in Iceland. And I think you and I both agree now. It's kind of funny, you know, like this was not a good fight, but nights like this, I think, bring out the best in boxing commentators like us or on boxing Twitter. So let's hear now from Kieran Mulvaney, my colleague at BoxingScene.com, who was in Texas much of last week and their ringside for Jake Paul versus Mike Tyson. I am very pleased to welcome our guest to this week's episode of the United Boxing Podcast. He is one of my favorite boxing writers and also one of my favorite science and nature writers. Kieran Mulvaney has covered boxing for 21 years and is my colleague at BoxingScene.com. Kieran, you just got back. Well, actually, you're still in Dallas after Jake Paul versus Mike Tyson. You've covered a lot of the biggest events in boxing. How did this compare?
It was one of the weirder events that I've covered in boxing, and if you spent any time around boxing, you know that's saying something. It was really interesting, David, in that I could sense the atmosphere really building. It felt huge. That you could tell that there was so much public attention on it. That people I hadn't spoken to in 10 years were suddenly texting me, and I'm sure you had the same experience, and writing to me about asking me what I thought. And then it was this very strange thing of being in this huge, very excited arena and then just feeling the air being let out of the balloon quite rapidly. And I don't think I've quite experienced that before. It wasn't like an anger. It wasn't anything. It was just kind of a feeling about the whole thing.
And was that air being let out of the balloon like the moment that they saw Tyson's knee brace or the first round or the second round? When did people begin to realize that this wasn't what they hoped it was going to be?
I'd say the second round, I think, as I think you and I and most other boxing writers knew that Mike would probably do what he could in the first, and then that would be it. And that's how it played out. And I think once he started to just turn into this stationary figure, just watching Jake dance around him and flick out jabs and basically be unable to do anything, that's when you sort of felt there were some scattered boos, but it was mostly just sadness or disappointment or deflation. And I've never seen so many people leave an arena so rapidly after a fight as well. Just almost like, let's get the hell out of here and get a drink kind of a thing.
It's so funny because the first boxing match I ever covered was Mike Tyson's final fight, and that was 19 years ago. He was done at 38, 39 years old, and none of us is going to be better in 19 years anyway. Why do you think people just didn't realize or maybe put so much hope in the fact that Mike Tyson would perform better than he wound up performing?
You know, it's interesting because I've been thinking about this, and it couldn't have happened with anybody else, right? This is a very specifically Mike Tyson related phenomenon, I think, in that people have airbrushed late Mike Tyson, basically anything post 1997, out of their memories. They still remember the explosiveness, the Michael Spinks win, the Bruno wins. And when they will think about the things that when stuff started going off the rail, they don't think about him just sitting there on the canvas back against the ropes after Kevin McBride shoved him down after he tried to bite Kevin's nipple off. They think about him losing his mind and biting Evander's ear off and things like that. Like even when when things were going bad, it was exciting. And you know, there is this phenomenon, this pop culture phenomenon with Tyson, and maybe it's also because he's one of the few fighters to have really broken through into the mainstream in the last 30, 40 years. So if people know boxers, like non-boxing fans, they probably know Mike Tyson and Floyd, maybe, of recent fighters. And so they just have this kind of memory, this image of that's what this guy is like. And this guy, Jake Paul, he can't box. Sure, there's an age difference, but what happens when he sees a real boxer? And those of us who are kind of up there near 58 or around 58, I think were those who most expected what happened to happen because we know what it's like. And I think there were people who were younger who maybe hadn't lived through the whole Tyson thing themselves and just saw highlights and all of that and didn't know that, bits start falling off and sagging and moving more slowly as you get older. They were the ones who still held out hope. And maybe it was a bit of a realization for everybody.
Kieran, I'm 42, and it's not great right now, but you're telling me that I have to look forward to things or sagging?
One or two things, maybe. And maybe the things falling off thing, that might have been an exaggeration, if that's any comfort.
I mean, we did get to see Mike Tyson's bare butt. I know that you didn't in the arena, but I'm sure you heard about it.
I did. It went straight into my social media feeds when I saw that. So that was, and I imagine, I know that people who are watching on Netflix have buffering issues. I hope that wasn't one of those occasions where up comes Mike Tyson's bare butt and then the great circle of doom that you can't move past it for seconds. That would have been something.
Years ago, I was on an overseas flight and they had movies, and I decided for some stupid reason to watch The Shining. I don't know if you've ever seen that movie, and I promise this story applies. There's a scene where an old woman who is unclothed stands up out of a bathtub, and that was the moment that the flight attendants decided to get on the intercom, and that's when the screen froze.
Fantastic.
Despite the technical issues, Netflix is coming out and saying that 60 million households, not people, households, which means that far more than that we're watching worldwide, that they peaked at 65 million. So this was a weird event, as you said, but it was a huge event. Do you think that we will get more shows like this from Netflix, from Jake Paul, from Mike Tyson?
Well, hopefully not Mike Tyson. And in fact, I kind of doubt that, actually. I'm not sure that he can sell this again against anybody. So, I mean, I think people realized what the reality of it was, and it wasn't so much down to Jake being a great boxer. It was just down to Mike being old. So, no, not Mike Tyson. Netflix and Jake Paul, I don't know. So, I spoke to Nikisa Badarian, who is Jake's business partner at MVP, and he said the whole deal was that they signed basically an open-ended thing with Netflix about doing an event with Jake Paul against somebody. And then the Tyson opportunity came up, and everybody peed their pants and went ahead and went with that. And so Nikisa said that there is an option open for them to continue this, depending how Netflix feels about everything. And I don't know. I think Netflix will probably think they need to either fire some engineers or hire a lot more. And I'm sure they'll have the bugs sort of shaken out because they're doing a live NFL show on Christmas Day. So they're certainly interested in continuing to do live sports. It's interesting. So they're interested in the idea, but it's like when you come out of the gate with something this immense, I don't know where you go with it afterwards. Do you just, do you want to just be in the Jake Paul business, or do you want to do something else? I don't know. I don't know how much this is replicable. It was just a weird mixture of pop culture and sports and everything, and nostalgia all came together. I guess it would depend on what their expectations are. If they only want to do 60 million households worldwide each time, then I don't know what else they're going to do. But if they want to just if they think there's an opportunity here for them to do big fights, I don't know. The production values were great when they weren't buffering. They were definitely interested. I don't know. I think it's a possibility, specifically with Netflix and with MVP. I've taken a long time to just say I don't know, but it's. I think that nobody's ruling it out. Everybody's into the idea. Everyone's just gonna, go into meetings and think about it. I just don't know what the event would be, but I think it's a possibility.
Yeah, and I think about the fact that we boxing fans are always hopeful that there will be more outlets to bring us more fights.
Mm.
I don't know that that is what Netflix would be doing because, the whole point is to earn money.
Right.
And I don't know how many people would be subscribing to Netflix solely for boxing that wouldn't already be subscribing to Netflix.
Right.
Without me talking to any Netflix executives, my guess is that by having something like this or the Tom Brady roast earlier the year, they have these one-off events so that people see Netflix with an even greater value than their tremendous library of programs. With that said, I think that when you see the number of households that tuned in for this, you can begin to wonder whether if you charge maybe a lower pay-per-view price than what boxing traditionally charges, that you can get big money and capitalize on the popularity or the antipathy towards Jake Paul. And that leads me, if I may, into the next question, which is, earlier this year, Jake Paul fought the second of his pro boxer opponents, somebody who had some pro boxing experience, but really wasn't that good. And after that is when I was thinking, oh, he really needs to actually face real opponents now. And then 6 days later, they announced the Mike Tyson fight. Where do you think, this is a two-parter, where do you think Jake Paul should go from here, from you as a boxing writer, and where do you think Jake Paul will instead go from here?
And so the difficulty with the should go question is, who is Jake Paul as a boxer and what does he want to be as a boxer? Where should he go if he wants to follow the traditional path of gradually increasing his opposition and getting better and getting higher in the rankings? Well, it doesn't matter what he should do because that's not what he's going to do, because that's not what he's interested in. There was another conversation that I was having with some folks actually post-fight, which is, well, now what does he do? That is the challenge. Like, how do you sort of top this? I wonder if this might not have worked out very well for Jake and for his appeal, in that I think he hoped that this would in some way validate him a little bit. Like, oh, look, among his casual fans, hey, look, Jake can even beat Mike Tyson. That's really impressive. The guy can really box. Whereas everyone who saw that knows exactly what happened. Jake basically arranged a glorified session of elder abuse. So I don't know what he needs. I don't know if he needs to do something else to get people back on board or not.
Yeah.
does he need to actually fight a sort of competent boxer who, weighs 130 pounds or something, that he can fight a dangerous opponent who isn't a dangerous opponent? I don't. I'm not entirely sure. I think he'll sort of sit and think, what's the next opportunity to come up? He's past the point of fighting other social media guys. I think there's no point in him ever fighting a KSI or anything like that. He's just on a totally different thing. I don't see the point for him, for his career, of doing okay, now I'll fight the number 27 ranked cruiserweight and show that I can do it. That's just not where he's at. That's just not what he's doing. So, but I do think that probably whoever he next fights, needs to have a sense of some kind of threat, because I think he needs to. My guess is that this didn't work the way he wanted it to, in that it didn't enhance his credibility. So and I think that credibility is important to him, as well as $40 million a fight. So he's just going to have to be on the lookout, I think, for some kind of left field opponent. Like everybody else, he of course wants to fight Canelo, and I suppose if Canelo wanted a very easy payday, he could do it. But I don't think Canelo wants to give him the credit, the opportunity. So yeah, I think he'll sit and think and see what comes up next. But I do think he needs to show a little bit more credibility as a boxer, because I think after this, the novelty might wear off quite rapidly unless he does something different.
Yeah, I completely agree. I feel like I understood why he did this fight. This was the biggest boxing match in the United States since Mike Tyson fought Buster Mathis Jr. For free on Fox back in 1995. That was shortly after. That was the second fight after Tyson got out of prison. So this, of course, was a huge payday. I do feel the risk-reward ratio for Jake Paul will change, but I don't think he's going to get to the point where it's risk in terms of, as you said, the number 20 rated opponent, but not enough reward commensurate with that. I can understand why he's talking Canelo or Conor McGregor. I imagine he'll call out other people, but I do think it is a little bit of a tightrope that he will be walking. But let's transition, if we may, to the fact that we had this huge audience and there were some real boxing matches on this. Netflix is claiming that 50 million households watched the rematch between Katie Taylor and Amanda Serrano. So as you and I are discussing or debating whether Jake Paul is good at boxing or good for boxing, how was the undercard in your mind? I mean, you didn't have to deal with buffering issues. You had two great fights preceding the main.
Yeah. And the folks in the arena, it's great. The folks in the arena loved it too, and they were ready for it, for that co-main event. I didn't think there was any way those two were going to be able to quite replicate the first fight, but with the drama around Amanda's eye, did they even maybe exceed it slightly? It was a phenomenal fight. It was a phenomenal fight, I thought, anyway. For it to be a women's fight on that platform that so many people got to see, I think that's fantastic. And that Mario Barrios fight just turned to a real slow burn, just real tough, hard slog of a fight. That I think was really an excellent introduction for people into what exactly tough boxing is all about. So I think. And honestly, even the YouTube streams beforehand, they were getting terrific numbers. I think between the Netflix YouTube and the MVP YouTube, they were getting like 1 million streams. I think Shadacia Green's fight got like about 1 million views on YouTube alone. So in that respect, I mean, the only super disappointing fight was, apart from the main event, was that Whindersson Gomez Niraj Goyat thing that was on there for a whole other reason. I think in that respect, that's got to be great. And I think women's boxing especially will be the real winner, because I'm sure there are a lot of people who've never seen a women's fight before. And we're like, holy cow, that's women's boxing? I want to see more of that. And to Jake Paul's credit, he's always wanted to push women's boxing. And he might have really, really, really succeeded in that on Friday night.
I know that boxing has always been looking in the United States to find some way to bring in the casual fans or the non-boxing fans and keep them around. I don't know that this will work, but it is great that this many people watched these fights. I saw somebody post on Twitter that it's the kind of thing that can translate into more fans for them. And that's the whole thing. Like, Jake Paul isn't facing anybody that we want to see him face in order for us to know whether he is a real prospect or just somebody who's capitalizing, but he's doing good for the people on his undercard. It's very interesting. You know, do you want to see a third fight between Amanda Serrano and Katie Taylor? And if not, where do they each go from here?
I wonder a little bit about how severe that injury is going to affect Amanda. I'm shocked that fight wasn't stopped. Probably anywhere other than Texas, like anywhere with any kind of competent commission and ringside physicians, you have to think that would have been stopped. I mean, she's going to need extensive plastic surgery. So I don't know what happens there. I personally, I mean, I thought it's a terrific fight and it's close to call. I personally thought Amanda won. Watching off TV, I thought she won the first fight too, personally, but super, super close both times. And can't be too upset about Katie winning. If they were to do a third fight, I'd like for Katie this time to make some concessions, right? She doesn't have to go all the way down to featherweight, obviously, but Amanda's gone up 2 weight classes and then 3 weight classes from her ideal. I know she goes up and down through the weight classes, and but clearly, like, that featherweight is really where she's at her best. I'd like to see Katie make some kind of concession, but that said, there was a little bit of bad blood at the end there, and Katie afterwards is like, I don't care what anybody else thinks. I don't care about what Amanda says. I don't care about what fans say. The 3 judges said I win. I'm 2-0 against her. So I don't think she's particularly inclined to make any concessions. I'd love to see Katie fight Amanda over 3-minute rounds, which is where Amanda really excels. I think we would have seen Katie knocked out twice had that happened. But Amanda needs to go away and heal up a little bit, and I think we won't see her in the ring for a little while. I was very impressed with Amanda because I had a sense over her last couple of fights that maybe she'd peaked a little bit, and she wasn't getting knockouts anymore, and she was still dominating. But I thought maybe just a little bit has gone off. But I thought this was a tremendous performance by her, win or lose. I thought she looked really, really strong, and Katie also dug deep and after that tough first round, fought very well, adjusted her own strategies. So, I'm not sure. I don't know enough about the depth in any of their divisions as to whom they should fight next. I think, Katie's probably going to be able to get another defense in, maybe another 2 before Amanda's even ready to get into the ring. And then we'll see where they're at as to whether they're going to be able to meet again in some kind of terms that are appealing to them. Amanda, in a strange way, has the advantage because she is going to have Jake pushing her, either way. So, yeah, I just think they need to go away and take a little bit of time to heal and see what happens. And I kind of get a sense that Amanda would probably want to go back down a couple of weight divisions. She talked a couple of times about the difficulty in getting back up into to 140. So yeah, I imagine we'll see her maybe pop back down for a fight or 2 when she does heal, and then we'll see. And maybe if she can't get a third Katie fight, maybe Amanda will be done with it. I'm not entirely sure.
I'm not surprised that the Texas Commission let Amanda Serrano keep fighting, given the fact that this is the same commission that allowed Mike Tyson to fight.
Well, exactly. Yeah.
Yep. I wonder if before we get a third fight with Katie Taylor versus Amanda Serrano, maybe we end up a third fight between Katie Taylor and the woman she beat to become the undisputed champion, Chantel Cameron. As for Serrano, of course, she was at one time the undisputed champion at 126. I don't know that she would drop all the way down, but I know if she does, the fight there would be Sky Nicholson. But domestically, for us here in the United States, I would love to see Amanda Serrano drop down to 130 and take on the undisputed champion there, Alicia Baumgardner.
Oh my God, yes, that would be a hell of a fight. That would be actually a terrific fight. I think she could handle Sky Nicholson fairly. I mean, Sky is a very good boxer, of course, but doesn't appear to have any kind of pop. And you have to figure you've got to be able to crack Amanda to deter her. If you're looking for opponents who have pop, Alicia Baumgartner's right there. I mean, I don't think she has the technique quite of Amanda, but God, she can hit. So I agree with you. I think that would be a fantastic fight. And especially if you want to capitalize on people, maybe there's the opportunity. People go, oh, yeah, I saw her fight on the Tyson card. I'd really like to see that. What's the follow-up fight you really want people to see? Sky Nicholson or Alicia Baumgartner? Like, of the two, I don't think there's any question about what would be the one if you want to maintain the popularity of women's boxing, which one you'd want to see.
Sure. Well, it'll be interesting to see what happens going forward. It'd also be nice for us to go back to covering some of these non-circuses, although boxing always brings up plenty of circuses, even when Jake Paul isn't involved. You and I both know this because we've been covering the sport for 20 plus years now. It's interesting how we both came to this from different angles or from different reasons. You were covering science and nature beforehand, is that? And then you got involved in boxing. What was your entry into boxing like?
So it was 2003. I was 35. I've been writing about science and nature and the environment really since I was 17, 18. And so here's the thing. I had just made a bit of money from a very, very stupid website. Some friends and I, during the Iraq War, put together a website called WeLoveTheIraqiInformationMinister.com. And, this was the guy who was like, there are no Americans anywhere in Baghdad, as you could practically see the tanks going in the background in the middle of the Iraq War. And we put together just like a really stupid website where we photoshopped him into a bunch of battles in the past and made up quotes for him. And we put a dead link saying, get your Iraqi Information Minister t-shirt here. Sent it to a few friends, thought it was funny. And 2 days later, we got email from an English rugby team going, hey, your t-shirt link is dead. We all really want a t-shirt. And so then we decided to make some t-shirts, and then it just started going viral. And Reuters wrote an article about us, and then it went completely nuts. And we ended up putting Iraqi Information Minister stuff on all kinds of things, frisbees and mouse pads, God knows what else, and made a small fortune in about a month. And with that money, I decided, because I'd always been a boxing fan, I want to do something different with my writing. I'm going to just take a little bit of time to go to Las Vegas, because I've always wanted to go to Las Vegas, and I'm going to do a book on Las Vegas boxing. And so I went down there, and I sort of just used previous books that I'd written as very expensive business cards to prove to people that I was legit, started getting credentialed for fights, met a whole bunch of people, did a whole bunch of interviews in Las Vegas, started hanging out in the Las Vegas fight scene, wrote most of the book, and sent it around a bunch of publishers, most of whom said words to the effect of, this is really interesting. Boxing fans don't buy books. We're not interested. And the publishers who were the least interested were the ones who just published boxing books, because they saw how poorly they did. And now I put all this effort into this. I had forgotten to pay taxes on the money that I'd earned off the stupid website. I use earned in the loosest sense on the money I had gained from the stupid website. So now suddenly, from having a nice bit of money from this stupid website, I was now in debt. And as I was trying to figure out what to do, my friend Rachel Charles, who I think you also know, was a publicist for Goosen at the time, said, hey, ESPN's looking for a freelance feature writer. Are you interested? I'm like, oh boy, am I. I need to make some money back somehow from this. And then I was sitting ringside at a fight in Las Vegas, and Fred Sternberg, who we also know, good friend of ours, publicist again, sat down and said, hey, Reuters is looking for a ringside stringer. Are you interested? And I'm like, boy, am I. I've got to make some money back somehow. And then I just ended up staying around boxing, and it just never went away. And here we are, really. So my plan to spend 6 months in Vegas writing a book has turned into 21 years of having something of a career.
Well, boxing is for the better because of it. You are so multi-talented, as a writer. You've done TV hosting, you've done podcasts, including with our mutual friend, Eric Raskin. And that's just in boxing. But, I remember, gosh, I think I was living in Vermont at the time, 15 years ago, when you had your second Washington Post magazine cover story
about
polar bears, which led me to your book. So Where does the science and nature writing fit into things? I imagine it must be nice to be able to flex multiple muscles.
Yeah, it really is. Look, I'll be honest with you. That's the aspect that I most enjoy, largely because I'm just like not writing about 58-year-old men getting more brain damage. And I kind of enjoy stretching that science muscle as well. So yeah, I think probably in terms of time, they probably take up about an equal amount. There's more variety in the science and writing aspect of it. I write probably an article or two a month for National Geographic. I'm working now with a organization called Polar Bears International, who hire me to do a whole bunch of articles and briefings on polar bears and on the Arctic and on climate change. And I've just finished another book, which is about the melting of the Arctic and whether there'll be commercial seaways through the Arctic. And that is what I really enjoy. And I often speak with somebody. Oh yeah, I write for National Geographic. And then if people keep prodding, I'm a little bit more sheepish about and I also write about boxing. Um, uh, I'll be honest with you, David. If I could earn enough money from just doing the science and nature stuff at this point, after 21 years of being ground down by being around the boxing business, I think I would do that. I don't think I'd do it the other way, like give up science and nature to be a full-time boxing writer. But you know what it's like. Look, I love boxing. I'm such a fan of the athletes. I admire. I'm interested in the sport. The boxers just continue to amaze me, like what they are able to put themselves through. I'm in awe of all of them every time. I find the stories fascinating. I love doing all of that. But the business, my God, I mean, I know you must feel it too. Just being around all of it just sometimes just makes me feel like having a very hot shower. It's just, it's rough, isn't it, dude? It can get to you, can't it? After a while, it's just not the boxers necessarily themselves, not the pure aspect of two athletes in the ring together, but everything else around it can be draining.
Yeah, I agree. There are times that I imagine myself just being happy, sitting in a cabin somewhere in the mountains, so long as I
Yeah.
had the ability to watch boxing and write about it from there. With that said, I still enjoy being ringside. I still enjoy being there for the fights, but also being there for the events, whether that is you and I at AT&T Stadium going up to the top, or walking around Montreal as we did, or just seeing some of our many friends and colleagues in the sport. But I'm glad that you have these multiple outlets. I know that this is a boxing podcast, but for anybody who's interested in science and nature, you are an excellent reporter and writer, and it's always fascinating to read your work.
Oh, thank you very much. And I have to say, I concur with you. Like looking back at this last week in Dallas, in many respects, I could have done everything without leaving home. It wasn't one of those deals where, like sometimes if you're at a fight at the MGM and you just park yourself in the media room and it's like, oh, here's Lennox Lewis, I'll grab him for an interview. Or here's, Bernard, I'll grab him for an interview. There was none of that. That was just a series of tightly managed events that were all streamed. And what interviews I did over the phone. And I'm like, I could have just stayed home with my cats. But there is something about being there. There is something about being at the event. And yeah, actually, candidly, spending a week with Fred Sternberg doesn't suck, right? And some of the other friends are turning around, oh, hey, Stitch, and so on and so forth. And yeah, that's actually kind of neat. That is a benefit. I completely concur with you that is a benefit. And when I did the HBO gig, it was a bit much in that I was on the road. Like we were probably doing 2 fights a month. And it's a lot of time on the road. But I did love the whole camaraderie of it all. I think you would use the word circus earlier, and it is. We're just a traveling freak show, right? And seeing each other in some different setting every few weeks or whatever. There's something to that. That is a benefit of the gig.
Yeah. Well, Kieran, thank you so much for joining us this week. For our listeners, how can they follow you on the socials?
So I've abandoned X. I've been gradually spending less and less time there, and I've decided to I'm just only on it for as long as it takes for me to find all the other accounts that I want to follow and find them on others. So you can find me on either Threads or Blue Sky as Kieran Mulvaney, and I'm starting to post a little bit more on both of those. So that's where you can find me.
And people can read your work throughout the week on BoxingScene.com. You did some great
Exactly.
work with the Mike Tyson Jake Paul fight. Kieran, thank you again for joining us.
Hey, thanks, David. I appreciate it.
Well, that was a good conversation and a very interesting one indeed. A real mix of worlds there, David.
Yeah, I mean, the fact that Kieran is both a boxing writer and a science and nature writer, he's been around two of the most ferocious beasts ever to roam the planet, and that is polar bears and Mike Tyson. Well, that's enough about Jake Paul versus Mike Tyson for now, and let's talk about some of the other big fights that happened last week. And the big event on Saturday was in Riyadh in Saudi Arabia. That was a card that was headlined by the cruiserweight unification bout between Gilberto Ramirez and Chris Billam-Smith. Darren, I know that you watched that fight. Was it hard for you, given the fact that you are as familiar with Chris Billam-Smith as you are, to watch him take the beating that he did?
Yeah, it was a tough watch. It was a really tough watch. I try my hardest, and Chris is an exception. Of like, we're not mates. You know, we're not mates or anything like that. I've got a soft spot for Chris Billam-Smith, and he's one of those fighters who I feel like I've been able to kind of warm to a lot and just chat away to him like a friend, like a mate, if I see him at shows. And I've built that relationship with him. I think I said on the podcast a few weeks ago that when I did a long form interview with Chris, I said, "Oh, can I come to the gym or meet you somewhere?" And he invited me into his home, and I sat there having a coffee with him, just chatting away, because that's just the sort of person he is. So I've built that connection with him, which I try not to do with people because I might be calling their fight, and I don't ever want to be biased, or I don't ever want to kind of let my emotions get in the way of it. So this one was different, and Ramirez was just too good. He was just too good. He beat Chris to the punch almost every single time. I didn't score it like I did with Serrano versus Taylor, so I can't tell you, accurately how many rounds I thought X got or Y got. If I did, Billam-Smith probably only got a couple of rounds. What did you make of it?
You know, I think it's okay to not necessarily have an affinity, but to enjoy talking to certain people in the sport. Some boxers are just better interviews than others, and some boxers come off more like actual people when they're outside of the ring and not just fighters. I thought that this fight was going to belong to Billam-Smith in that opening round. He landed a couple good shots very early on, but Ramirez, to his credit, took those punches and just showed so much better skill and has truly grown into a more than competent cruiserweight, which is unexpected. You know, Billam-Smith has been at cruiserweight his entire career. Gilberto Ramirez started as a middleweight, held a super middleweight title, was a contender at light heavyweight, lost to Dimitri Bivol, and now here he is. He can probably be considered the number 2 cruiserweight in the world. Just landed some great combination punches. I think he hurt Billam-Smith repeatedly. I was hoping that Billam-Smith's corner would stop the fight as opposed to letting it go the distance just because of the amount of punishment that he was taking. I'm hoping that Billam-Smith is okay. I imagine it'll take some time for him to recover as well. What this means now for Gilberto Ramirez, he may or may not have a mandatory coming up. Jai Opetaia might have a mandatory coming up, but at some point in 2025, I would love to see Gilberto Ramirez versus Opetaia.
Yeah, and just rewinding to Billam-Smith, and I'll come on to Zerdo in a second. Tactically, I wonder if Shane McGuigan and Chris got it right on that night, because normally, and maybe they did, but Ramirez was just too good, and he was too quick, and he was just winning the exchanges over and over again. But normally, like Shane McGuigan is probably one of the best tacticians in the game. So I do wonder if there was a rematch and they had a different approach, how that would go. But yeah, it was a bit of a shutout performance in the end. which leads me on to what happens next for Zerdo Ramirez, and whether it's the next fight due to mandatories or not. How good is Ramirez versus Jai Opetaia? That has got a fight of the year contender written all over it, hasn't it?
It truly does. And I think I saw it was either Adam Abramowitz or somebody else on Twitter noting the fact that Opetaia, as good as he is, has shown an occasional tendency to fade later on. And if Ramirez is able to sustain the pace that he was able to show against Billam-Smith, that could be a tough night for Opetaia at the office.
Yeah, no, it could be. But how good is that cruiserweight division, though? Like, just kind of stepping back from that fight, like the amount of domestically great fights there are to make, like at a European level, world stage, and then that elite stage as well. Like, you could have a... I don't know if you watched it when it was on. Did you watch the World Boxing Super Series when that was on a few years ago, put on by the Sauerlands?
I watched some of those fights. You're talking about the one that was won by Alexander Usyk in the championship after facing some guys like Barrios and several of the other great cruiserweights.
That's it. Can you imagine how good of a tournament that would be now with all of those cruiserweights in the mix? Like even some of the kind of like lower level cruiserweights, not your Opetaias or your Zerdo Ramirez, like that would be sensational. I wonder if Turkey Al Sheikh is got something like that on his mind. I think it would work, don't you?
I think so, and that's been the premise and the promise of the cruiserweight division for all these years. I remember Showtime back in the mid-2000s was putting on the likes of Jean-Marc Mormac, O'Neal Bell, Wayne Braithwaite, some of these great cruiserweights. And the fun of the division is that, as Billam-Smith said in our interview the other week, they are basically the size of what Muhammad Ali was when he first turned pro. So they have that speed. They have that power. They throw in greater volumes than you tend to see at heavyweight. So they tend to put on some of these entertaining fights. And so long as there's not the continued allure of fighters moving up to heavyweight, you notice I didn't say the allure of moving to bridgerweight because I don't think that is quite there yet. So long as people aren't continuing to be tempted for the big money against these bigger opponents in the heavyweight division, I think that we could continue to see a renaissance at cruiserweight.
Yeah, I do, and I love the tournament format. Years ago in the UK, we used to have something called Prize Fighter, kind of is what it says on the tin, and they were great. They were absolutely brilliant because there was things like knockout bonuses on there, and you get even more of a knockout bonus if it ended in the first round, and that sort of stuff in the cruiserweight division, and chucking people that you may not think are ready for it, and just watch them like shine. Someone like Chev Clark, who's an up-and-coming cruiserweight in the UK, stick someone like him in there. Oh God, I'm getting excited about it already, and it's probably not even been thought about.
It was a very entertaining, if more one-sided conclusion to that show. I don't know how much of the rest of the undercard that you watched.
Oh yeah, I watched the majority of it. I watched most of it. I thought it was a pretty decent card actually for the kind of boxing purists. It probably didn't capture the imagination of those who were tuning in on Netflix at Friday night, but yeah, there was some pretty high level fights.
I don't know what was the most noteworthy to you of the undercard, but for me, I wasn't really thrilled by the fight between Arnold Barboza and Jose Ramirez. The only question I have after that is whether Barboza will get the title shot at 140 and what that means for Jack Catterall. I enjoyed the fight between lightweight contenders William Zepeda and Tevin Farmer. Farmer hurt and dropped Zepeda. And it's funny because Zepeda had been ranked number one by all four of the sanctioning bodies. And it looked like Zepeda was going to be heading towards Shakur Stevenson because this fight was for the WBC interim title. After watching that fight, I don't know that Zepeda can beat Shakur Stevenson. Shakur and Tevin Farmer don't necessarily have the same style, but it looks like Zepeda is vulnerable to be hurt and dropped, and Stevenson is, of course, an expert boxer.
I don't know if there's many out there who are good enough to beat Shakur Stevenson. He's a pretty special talent, isn't he? He does everything so very well, and he's gritty as well. Like you see it with some fighters. I see it every week commentating on fighters. You see who wants it, and who doesn't quite want it. And with Stevenson, he wants it every single moment of that fight, whoever he's fighting.
But if your team's Zepeda, you also can't be seen as taking a step backward from here. You're right on the verge of a title shot. And while it might be smart for the manager or trainer to have your fighter be as well prepared, if they are seen as ducking Stevenson for the second time, because they had been in negotiations to fight just a few months back, that might hurt his reputation. But then again, so would losing to Stevenson. That said, they could aim for like a Denis Berinchyk or for a vacant title if Vasily Lomachenko does end up retiring. There was one other really eventful fight on the undercard, and that was the unification fight at 105 between Oscar Collazo and knockout CP Fresmart. And knockout got knocked out with a fantastic performance by Collazo. I know that people who like to demean these lighter weight classes often like to say that these guys are feather-fisted, but Collazo has some clear power and some clear skill. What did you think of that performance?
It was nasty, wasn't it? It was really nasty. Some of those body shots were really unforgiving. I thought it was one hell of a performance, and it was a good advert for the lower weight categories, and obviously that one being at minimum weight. As soon as those guys walk in the ring, they do look tiny in that ring because like their heads barely go above the fourth rope, don't they, the top rope, but they put on some display, and it was probably, apart from the main event, my favourite fight of the evening.
Yeah, and Collazo beat a very good opponent. For people who weren't familiar with knockout CP Fresmart, which I can't blame them, he's fought overseas and away from American and British Airways for such a long time. But Fresmart he was the longest reigning title holder in boxing, dating back to 2016. And now that he's lost, the longest reigning title holder, active title holder, is Artur Beterbiev. Fresmart had more title defenses than Collazo had fights. But this is a sign, as we saw with guys like Naya Inoue, that in these lighter weight classes, it's not necessarily the number of fights that you have, but the skill and experience that you bring to the table.
Yeah, it is. And I think, I wonder now we've got the whole Riyadh season stuff happening, and those Riyadh cards seem to be happening a lot more often now, that we'll start to see some of those guys in the lower weight classes getting the airtime which they deserve, because it's a pretty competitive area of the boxing world when you go down there, and the level which they operate at. There's a reason that God made them 5'2" and not 6'2", isn't it?
Well, being entertaining is the immediate way to get that kind of attention. Again, I mentioned Inoue, Roman Chocolatito Gonzalez, all these lighter weight classes that are getting attention now is not because they're out there boxing technical matches, throwing three punches around. It's because they're going out there and putting on good battles and showing some skill along the way. Well, we talked about the fights that happened on Friday. We've talked about the fights that happened on Saturday. Let's talk about some of the other boxing news that came out within these recent days. And much of that has to do with what's coming up. Finally, official is a fight between two light heavyweight contenders. It's David Benavidez and David Morrell. They will be headlining a pay-per-view on February 1st. And a fantastic fight on the undercard is the rematch between featherweights Brandon Figueroa, who now has the WBC title at 126, and Stephen Fulton, who had taken a very close decision over Figueroa when they fought at 122. I don't know if you have any thoughts on this card, but I'm excited for it.
Again, with entertaining being the words, are you not entertained? We always have a theme, don't we, when we record these podcasts? And I think entertained and entertainment and entertaining is the one of this one, especially with your boxing scene article, which we mentioned at the top of the show. David Benavidez is an entertaining fighter, and he's one of those ones which is must watch. So in terms of this side of the pond, that is the name which has grabbed me and the attention of boxing fans on this side of the Atlantic. So always look forward to watching him. And nice to see that there is shows being announced for early next year already. That's a good sign.
Yes, although I'm surprised that we still don't know what's going to happen with Gervonta Davis's next fight against Lamont Roach Jr., which we thought was going to be December. And now if it's going to happen, maybe we're looking at March. One final thought on Benavidez versus Morrell. I'm so glad to see these two contenders facing each other, given the fact that they're not necessarily going to get an immediate shot at Artur Beterbiev. So let's see these two guys face each other for the chance at waiting on the winner of that rematch between Beterbiev and Bivol whenever it does happen. You were talking about the other side of the pond. The other fights that are coming up are on the other side of the pond. I know that this coming week we've got Harlem Eubank fighting on Channel 5. For those of us in the United States, how good or not is Eubank?
He's good. He's fast. He's slick. I don't think he's a world champion in the making, but he is a decent fighter. I've watched him live at York Hall on a few occasions on these Channel 5 shows, and yeah, he's pretty impressive. But how impressive will he look when he goes up the levels and he starts to fight some of these kind of better operators, the ones who really know their way around the ring and the ones who really know how to go up and down the gears as a 12-round contest goes on. That is something for us to wait and find out about. However, the guy which Harlem Eubank is facing, Nurali Erdogan, has been tipped to me by a very well-known matchmaker who I won't say his name because he might kill me, but he reckons that he's decent, like really decent. So that might be an interesting one to keep your eye on.
It's interesting because if you look at Erdogan's record, he's 16-3. He's only won one fight via knockout, but sometimes fighters will be more than their record. People might see that last name Eubank and they're wondering, oh, well, what is his relation? And he is the nephew of Chris Eubank Sr., which means that he's the cousin of Chris Eubank Jr. I know that Harlem Eubank's father was a pro fighter, but was he anybody of consequence?
No, he wasn't a like Chris Eubank Senior was, the one. He was the one on terrestrial television that if I ask my 86-year-old nan to name 3 boxers, she'll name Muhammad Ali, Mike Tyson, and Chris Eubank. But yeah, he's the only really kind of very well-known, famous Eubank who kind of did anything significant in the sport.
So Harlem Eubank is the Bobby Pacquiao of this brotherly relationship.
A great analogy.
Yep. So the other major show, and I'm putting major in quotation marks, is the conclusion of a tournament. And you were talking about tournaments. Overtime Boxing this year has been doing a junior middleweight tournament. And one of the fighters in the finale is Brandon Adams. This is his 4th tournament that he's competed in. Over the past decade, he was on 2 of these BoxingScene tournaments on ESPN, one at middleweight, one at junior middleweight. He went on to fight in The Contender, which was a reality competition in the United States. He won that. He beat Shane Mosley Jr., speaking of sons of famous fighters, in the finale for that. And he was able to parlay that victory into a loss against Jermall Charlo. So Brandon Adams is in the finale, and he's facing an undefeated fighter named Andreas Katsarakis. So that will be on the 22nd, and that will be on DAZN. Otherwise, the other news coming up, I know that we'll be talking more next week, but Sonny Edwards is facing Gal Yafai on November 30th. And then we've gotten the announcements of a couple fights. We've got Tasha Jonas versus Habazin on December 14th, and Dillian White will be fighting on December 15th. Any thoughts on the Jonas or White fights?
Interesting to see Dillian White coming back because obviously it was publicized that he had failed a couple of drugs tests, and if you see with the location of that fight, he's fighting in Gibraltar, which is British territory in Gibraltar, of course. But is that because he's not being licensed under the British Boxing Board of Control? I think that's probably the case with that one. Dillian White really has taken a few steps back. When you think about only a few years ago, 2 or 3 years ago, he was screaming Deontay Wilder's name at every single opportunity. He was a number 1 with the WBC for something like 200 days or something ridiculous like that, or even more than that, 300 days. I can't remember how long it was, and he never got his opportunity to fight Wilder. And when his opportunity finally came and he fought Tyson Fury, he got obliterated, didn't he? And it hasn't been great ever since then, especially with the accusations of him failing drug tests. But yeah, a bit sad to see, to tell you the truth, and just nice to see Natasha Jonas getting another date. She hasn't boxed since I think it was February this year, so good to see her back out. She hasn't got masses of time left in her career. And then, of course, a fight which everyone will be looking forward to is Sonny Edwards versus what I'm told by many people is the best of the Yafai brothers. Of course, Cal Yafai was a world champion. Gamal Yafai didn't go on to win anything near a world title, but everyone who knows the Yafais and who's been around them for a long time has always said that Gal Yafai is the man. Can he beat Sonny Edwards? There's been a bit of a family rivalry between those two families for quite a long time because Charlie Edwards and Cal Yafai were meant to fight and it never happened. But we'll get onto that a lot more next week.
And I'm looking forward to the guest that we're going to have next week as well, but we will not get ahead of ourselves on that. With all that news covered, let's talk about our fighters of the week. Darren, who do you want to spotlight?
So, my fighter of the week is a really good one. It is a young girl called Rianna Doforo, who is from Liverpool. She is 16 years old. She might be getting on for 17 years old now. The reason her age comes into this is because she's 2-0 and she turned pro at 15 years old. And in the United Kingdom, I don't know about the US, but you can't be a pro at 15 years old. But, David, where can you be a pro at 15 years old?
Mexico?
In Mexico. So, this young girl from Liverpool, hard as nails, has had 2 professional fights. The first one when she was 15, out in Mexico. The second one when she was 16 years old, out in Mexico. And on the 6th of December, guess where she's going for her third pro fight?
Oh, I can't think of it. Where's it going to be?
Mexico. She is going to be one of those fighters to look out for. I don't know if I've ever known a British fighter to ever go and do anything like that, to turn pro so young. 15 years old. Think how young you are when you're 15. You think you're really old, don't you? But you're really not. And you got to take your hat off to her and her trainer, and I think it's her manager as well, Steffi Ball, who we've spoken about a bit on this podcast over the last couple of months. Think she has got every bit of potential to go on and be a proper name in the sport. And to say that she's got guts to go to somewhere like Mexico City and fight a tough Mexican as a teenager, I think that's the last thing I'm going to say.
Well, thank you for spotlighting her. I am going to spotlight somebody that we talked about already a bit on this episode, and that is Tevin Farmer. You know, it's been interesting watching his career. He started his career 7-4-1. And so to be able to go on to have the career he's had has been very impressive. I first became acquainted with him in July of 2016, and that was on the undercard of Carl Frampton's win over Leo Santa Cruz in Brooklyn, New York. Farmer just impressed so much in that fight. And then within a few years, he won a vacant world title. He beat Billy Dibb for a world title at 130 in 2018. But by 2020, he lost that to Jojo Diaz. And it just seemed like we might have seen the last of Tevin Farmer up at the top. His last 2 fights have been losses, but they've been very good performances in defeat. So in July, he fought one top lightweight contender, Raymond Murtaya, and gave Murtaya his toughest test yet. Murtaya won that by unanimous decision, but it was somewhat close on the scorecards. And here he was holding Zepeda to a split decision on Saturday in Riyadh. Normally when guys are losing regularly against top tier opponents or top contenders, that's a sign that they've hit their ceiling. But I got to tell you, I'm looking forward to seeing Tevin Farmer again. Until he's dispatched easily, I think that he is somebody to watch and somebody not to take your eyes off of or to take too easily at 135.
He's always been an enjoyable fighter to watch as Tevin Farmer, and you forget how long he's been a pro for. It was 2011 in which he made his pro debut, and I don't know about you, but for me, that feels like an awful long time ago. And there's been some really, really good fights in between then and now. And yeah, I don't think he's done. I think at 34 years old, there's life in the old dog yet. A good fighter of the week.
Well, Farmer's not done yet, but you and I are done for this week. So let's say thank you to everybody for tuning in for this very eventful episode where we talked about Tyson, Jake Paul, Chris Billam-Smith, Gilberto Ramirez, and everything else in between. We're on every Tuesday. You can find us on your favorite podcasting platforms. And before then, you can find us on social media. I'm on Twitter at FightingWords2, and you can follow the show at United Boxing Pod. Darren, how can people find you?
On all social media at Darren Rees, REES, and that is an underscore after that. TikTok, Instagram, X, the whole shebang.
Darren, it's always a pleasure doing this with you. I'll see you next week.
Adios, amigo.